Now, you mentioned Janet Maslin, who put her nose up to these types of movies and as you said, looked at them as pornography almost. I heard that she wanted to debate you on something, and then she backed out.
Yeah, well, if you remember Ted Koppel's Nightline, she wrote a Sunday piece about, the pornography of violent, ultra-violent films. And it was not very well researched because I could have given her better examples of ultra-violent films. but Ted Koppel wanted to have her and me on the same show, and I agreed to do the show, and then she backed out. She didn't want to be the spokesperson for censorship. And there was a period where the MPAA ratings board was really tough on sex, and they weren't tough at all on violence. And then in the early 80s, they switched, and they became very easy on nudity and very tough on violence. And the movie that turned that around was, oddly enough, was Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was responsible for the whole PG-13 thing, because they couldn't give it an R because if kids couldn't see it, it wouldn't make money.
Yeah.
And so, but they were afraid that the mothers were going to think it was too violent. And so they invented the whole PG-13 thing.
Yeah.
But as you go later into the 80s, they start giving NC-17s to stuff like Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer.
Right.
They didn't want to give it a rating at all. The distributor kept cutting it and sending it back to the ratings board and saying, "Hey, if I cut this, can I get my R?" And finally, the head of the MPAA called him up and he said, "You know what the rating of this movie should be?" He said, "It should be an S for," and he says the word that you would imagine he would say, for S. That movie is rated S. That's what we think about it.
Wow.
And they said, "No, you're not going to get an R." So he just put all the stuff back in that had originally been in the movie and said, "Oh, they're not going to give me the R anyway, so I'll just take it out NC-17.
Right. And, a lot of these movies that were edited now are being released on DVD and things like that with some of those scenes that were cut back in, and what's your thoughts on that? I mean, it's you've seen it one way for many years, and then all of a sudden you see those deleted scenes.
Yeah, well, it's a case by case thing. I mean, in some cases, the movies were really damaged by attempts to get a rating. An example is My Bloody Valentine. My Bloody Valentine came out in February of, I think, 81. John Lennon had been murdered in December, and 3 months before. And for some reason, that event at the time was being blamed on media exposure. And Jack Valenti, the head of the MPAA, thought that movies were going to be blamed for the John Lennon murder. And so he did a massive crackdown on anybody that had horror films before the board. And they said, no, everything has to come out. All the explicit, anything resembling explicit gore has to come out of the movie.
Wow, yeah.
And so they totally eviscerated that movie. Now, they couldn't have predicted, the advent of VHS and DVDs and, all the things of the next few years. And so they did not save the cut footage, and they couldn't find it years later when it was time to restore the movie. So it's basically still the same version that was badly damaged by that hysteria. 6 months later, they forgot all about it. If the movie had come out 6 months later, they wouldn't have cared. They would have let it fly right through with an R rating.
It's crazy how things like that happen. Just it could make the whole world a difference.
Yeah.
The
ratings board has one purpose: maximize profit for the industry.
Yep.
and people have to understand that that's what they're doing.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
so if it's a time where people are really sensitive to violence, they're going to crack down on violence.
Yeah.
If it's a time where people are really sensitive to sex, they're going to crack down on sex.
Right.
They always, and they'll use those terms, sex and violence. These movies are full of sex and violence, unless they like the movie, and then they'll say romance and adventure.
Yeah, that's very true. So speaking of censorship and things like that, you started your TV show with Drive-In Theater on the Movie Channel, where it's, pretty much anything goes. You could say and show the movies however they were, originally put out. There's no editing for TV. And then you moved over to TNT with Monster Vision. I mean, that must have been a pretty big difference.
Yeah, even though when I was on the Movie Channel, even though it's premium cable, so you're not subject to any kind of censorship, they still had a too grisly for cable list, movies that they would not show, that they considered too horrendous. And one of them was the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That movie was banned from cable for, I don't know, something like 26 years.
Wow.
I mean, it was not until they announced the remake that finally people gave up their fight against the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. For years, it was the favorite example of a congressman if he was going to talk about, depraved media in America.
Yeah.
Stuff like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah.
And that's because it was one of the greatest titles
of
all
true.
time.
That's very true, yeah. I mean, that's on TV all the time now.
Oh, I know. If you're familiar with the Italian movie Demons, that one was considered too intense for premium cable. You had, even though they were showing Total Recall every week, Total Recall has something like 350 on-screen killings in it. So
yeah.
Anyway, so then I go over to TNT, and the Turner networks at the time were very family-oriented. They're based in Atlanta, and they had an extensive list of rules and things you couldn't say and things you couldn't do on TV. I had to stop smoking the cigars on TV. They weren't going to let me drink beer on TV either, until, I pointed out that they had a lot of beer sponsors for the NASCAR,
yeah.
franchise, and they kind of like lightened up on the beer. But the most interesting thing is there are things they didn't want me to say, so I would invent nonsense words, to cover, it's just funny words to say whatever I want to say, aardvarking and wangdoodle and, and the words that I made up would start showing up on the official list of forbidden words. And I was like, you can't do this. They're not real words. How can you put these on the list?
Wow.
And they were especially upset because I was talking one week about, I was calling these people slopeheads. And they put that on the list and said, you can't call people slopeheads. That's a derogatory term. And I said, who? I said, I didn't know it was derogatory. Who was I?
Yeah. Who are you offending?
Making fun of.
Right.
And they said, that's an Asian derogatory term. And I said, no, it's slant eye is the derogatory Asian term, not slopehead.
Right.
You're confusing the words because they start with SL, Nevertheless, they stood their ground and said no more slopehead references on our TV network. But in general, they didn't really watch the show or notice the show because we were on so late at night and we came on at different times and it was on the weekend, and I had to be careful because if I ever made a presentation for the sales force or something, I might show them something that they didn't know was on their own network, and so we were kind of a stealth a stealth show, you know.
Yeah.
We came on about 11 o'clock, and we could just go as late as we wanted to because they didn't care when we finished.
Yeah, I heard that your show could kind of just go until like the next block of TV started at like 6 a.m. That's incredible.
6 a.m. We just had to be out by 6 a.m. So we could finish at 4:30. We could finish at 3:30. And we occasionally did all night marathons. You know, where we would be out right at 6 a.m.
Wow.
If we finished early, they would just fill in with short form programming.
Right.
You know, that freedom is what allowed me to just like go on and on about it.
And I mean,
about the film.
It's what made the show so great is that it did feel so live, and it was a very spontaneous, free flow type of feel that you just don't get on TV. TV has changed so much.
No, I don't think that will ever come back. I mean, it's remarkable that even in the late 90s you could still do that, and I attribute that to one man, Ted Turner. I mean, Ted Turner kind of. It's not that he made that policy or he had anything directly to do with the show, but there was a sense of freedom at the network simply because he was the renegade guy in the TV business.
Yeah.
And you weren't under all the kind of restrictions you would have been at one of the major New York networks,
right.
You know.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I love that just that freeness that you had over there. And you have certain late night hosts that still present horror movies, but it feels very scripted. It was nothing like the shows that you did. And another thing I want to say about the shows that you did is that you could see that you really cared about those movies, like whereas a lot of other hosts, maybe I won't name names, but kind of almost air them just to goof on them. You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Well, there've always been the two strands of late night hosting. The original late night horror host was Vampira in L.A. and Vampira was just a model. She was a Vegas showgirl, and she just made wisecracks. And I don't think she ever watched a single movie that she was involved with. You know,
yeah.
It was just eye candy around the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other founder of late night hosting is John Zachary, who was at a local TV station in Philadelphia and kind of invented incorporating the commentary into the movie that you're watching. He would even go so far as to cut himself into the scenes of the movie. And he played sort of a lame version of Dracula, intentionally lame version of Dracula, and did comedy, but he incorporated it into the film. My philosophy was we should be celebrating the film, no matter how bad they were, and we occasionally did have some real stinkers. There's a way to enjoy it, you know, and we'll find that way.
Yep.
I was not a big fan of the hosting where it's basically just stunts and sketches, where you're just, you're doing a little comedy bit at the commercial breaks. There's no other connection to the movie.
Exactly.
And so yeah, it was a place to. I love it when people come up to me and say, "You made me appreciate those movies." I say, I'm working in special effects now. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. Because I never heard anybody that like really appreciated how the movies were made, and I love it when people say that. So
yeah, absolutely.
That was much of the fun, and we didn't have resources to find out how the movies were made. We didn't have the extensive resources that people have today.
Yeah, that's what made it all the more impressive, I think, is when you would give the drive-in total, how many breasts were exposed or how many car crashes or whatever it was. It was like you can't look that stuff up on the internet back when you were doing that show.
Right, and we couldn't even sometimes identify who the real director was of the movie because for example, we showed a lot of Italian horror. Well, when those Italian horror films were originally made, they tried to disguise them so they look like American films. In Italy, they're the best in the world at dubbing, and so they can dub those European actors where you can't really tell that they're European. And they would do things like they always put a box of Kellogg's cornflakes on the kitchen table, just as an indicator. This is America. It's really America. Yeah. I know it might seem a little off in your subconscious, but it's America, you know? Yeah. And so all the Italian directors had fake English names. Some of them had 12, 15 fake English names.
Wow.
You know, and we didn't know what their real name was. We knew that the name they put on the movie was suspect. But we had to sort of like we were flying blind as far as finding people who could tell us, exactly who made the film, and in some cases who was in the film.